I am so excited. If there's one thing that I'd say is the most important thing when it comes to enjoying your hobby and art, it's to really enjoy the subject you're working on. If you don't enjoy the model, it becomes a chore to get it painted, and you don't do your best. Pretty obviously, by all my model choices, I love painting beasts and creatures of all types the most. So this month, being the start of Beastmen from One Page Rules, means I'm going to have a lot to love for a long little while. But that also means there's going to be a lot to paint in the end as well. So why not take the opportunity to really focus in on some of the more common parts and themes among them. This video is going to be about corroded and damaged armor. These Beastmen centaurs certainly have a lot of body to cover, which means lots of that scrap steel to work on. I've got 3 of them ready to go for 3 different ways to do it, from beginner to advanced. However, these are one of the few models that have actually been hollowed to help save some resin on printing. So first things first, I'm going to show you how I fill those gaps. To fill the gap, the first thing I had to do was find something the same size as the gap. In the case of these ones, I was able to find some bamboo skewers that had a perfect diameter equal to the holes in the model. Well, on one of the models it fit right into it perfectly, but on the others it was a little large, so I whittled it down with my hobby knife, pointing away from me of course, until it fit. Once I had it in, I used my snippers to mark off the depth and pull it out, then made a cut a little lower along the skewer and fit the resulting piece into the opening. From here, there's a couple of ways you can fill the gap. Filling it with super glue and letting it dry, putty, but for me, I like to do something that requires getting the gloves on. In addition, I have to have some loose resin from my stash for 3D printing, a toothpick, and a UV flashlight. I'm going to fill the gaps with resin. The bamboo absorbs some of it, but the rest just fills in and sits around the small gaps around the edges. Though if I put in too much, I did have to get some paper towel to wick some out, then just harden it with the flashlight. If it was still a bit too concave, I'd add a bit more and harden it again. For the cleanup, there's a couple ways as well. Either just carefully using the hobby knife to peel some layers away until it's even with the surrounding model. Or if you've got some files and a mask on your face, you can file them down until they're even. I found the knife was a little bit better on this one, but the idea is to make them seamless. And though it looks like a banged together mess at the moment, with some primer, no one ever knows there was even holes. First things first is we have to get a metallic base layer. I'm going to use this as the base for all 3 weathering methods, but it's also a pretty simple way to get a textured metal if you're looking for something quick for the tabletop. And it starts with a mix of your darkest steel metallic mixed with a black as a base coat on everything metal, which on these guys is a lot. Now I want to take just the pure dark metal and texture up the surface of all the plates. This is where you can get really crazy and chaotic, because what we want is random. By just touching the brush to random spots on the face of the metal plates, we can get a simple texture. No need to get too precious with it either. Just touch and go until the surface is covered in scratches. With the surface textured, we can then also grab all the edges. No need to be too careful with this one either. Its job is just to make sure that the texture has a bit of an outline, so it doesn't matter if it's a bit thick or if we just use the edge of the brush to get the sharp sides. It's only there to frame what we just did and make sure we get an opaque glare from the metallics. For the last little highlight, we have a few ways of doing that too. The simple way will be to grab a flat, old, or cheap brush as a dry brush. Get some of the silver flakes into the bristles by dipping it into a medium silver paint and rubbing it into a paper towel to dry it off. Then whisking the bristles across the surface of our metallic, just to catch all those raised edges along the edges and sharp points. Second method is a bit more careful, and that's to line them in yourself, using a nice, but since this is metallic, preferably cheap or older brush. Then it's just all the same technique as normal paints, edge highlighting the edges, layering on the surface, and painting in scratches with some freehand. This doesn't need to be at all perfect with whichever method you use at this stage, so don't stress. Though if you do want a clean dark metal look, it would be possible to take that care in the last step and finish on that note. You'll have a nice dark metallic, textured armor quite easily done. The first method is the classic, and that's just to paint it on, and it can be simple enough with only a few colors. The basic colors we need are an orange and a black. The more earthy your orange, the better. I'm using a red oxide, but as long as it's not too light, any hue of orange should work. If you've ever tried to find a brown in a computer program, you'll notice that there's not really a hue for them, but instead they're just found near the oranges and reds when we darken them up a bit. Well, same goes for paint. Add some black to orange and you've got a brown. Simple. And where we're going to start. Getting the brown and then thinning it until it's about half opacity. Then on the metal, just give it a glaze of this brown. It should settle into the ridges, but also turn the metal brown. Once it dries, we can add a bit more orange to that mix and do it all over again. But try to pull the paint to settle in around the places the metal's been punched with holes or dented or scratched, since that's the areas our rust would form. And going in with the pure orange now, we're not going to thin this that much, because instead of glazing, we're going to stipple it around the rusted areas, because we want this a bit more opaque to actually be our rust. Just adding dots of it around the scratches and dents and holes. Though if that's still a bit too much precision for your skill level yet, one big dot will work just as well. The last step will be the cleanup. I'll have to do this with other methods too, so for this one I'll show a dry brush cleanup, though you can do the other one I'll show later if you prefer that look. For the dry brush, it's exactly the same as we did when we got the metal started with a base coat. Just this time, I add a little bit lighter silver flakes and try to focus my strokes near the edges so I don't get much near the flat parts I just rusted up. This is still method 1, but I want to include ways we can take it just a little bit further by using some alternative hues and mediums. The thing about rust and earth tones is there's actually lots to choose from, though it might depend on what paint lines you like to use. But what we're looking for is more earthy reds and yellows, so that we can adjust the hue around the orange rust to give it a bit more depth. Everything up until the first brown glaze is the same. We can even use the same brown we made from the black and orange for it. After that though, I like to introduce some reds and terracottas into the palette to start the color from, but also some ultra matte medium. The thing about rust is, it's dull, like really dull. In fact, a lot of these colors are actually made from rust, which has a bit of a full circle feel to it, which is satisfying, but means that for a proper rust look, our rust shouldn't have any glare, thus ultra matte. Like the original orange, this would just get stippled onto the rusted areas with a pretty opaque layer, but kind of like the original metal that was done, quite sparingly and randomly in those areas. Once the opaque layer is in, we would want to then thin it to about half opacity like we did for the original brown. Then go in with the stippling again around the opaque stippling we've already done. It'll fill in some of the color gaps, but leave that texture. Next verse, same as the first, but with adding some of those earthy yellows to our rust orange to make it even brighter. Making sure to add the matte medium, unless of course you already use a matte paint. Stippling around the rust points, though with this we can also look at the overall model and choose more specified places for the lighter rust to go, where there might be more corrosion due to exposure or large scratches. And like with the last layer, give it a light glazing stipple to really finish off the rusted look. This method I actually think is easier than the last one, but requires something not found in beginner paint sets, and that's pigment powders. If you ever wanted to know what paint looked like without the stuff that makes it paint, well, this is it. It's essentially the raw stuff that gives paint its color and can be quite magical when it comes to bases and corrosion. While you can use additives with it to make it do some funky things, I like to use it dry to start, which means I need to make sure my brush is nice and dry as well. I'll start with the darker brown, just like I did for the paint method. It works by getting a little bit of the powder into the bristles, then on the model itself, kinda jabbing it into the metal plates and dust around it like you're sweeping the floor. It should put a nice dusty layer over your metal exactly like the glaze did, but even more dusty, which in this case is what we want. Pigment powders can also be used with wet ingredients like alcohol or mediums, or in this case just water. By adding a bit of moisture, we can have it go on a bit more opaque in areas, but still dry, dull, and dusty. So by adding just a bit of water and jabbing this lighter color into my rusted areas, it will quickly build up so that the rust is opaque. Normal paint, when we add water, it will still dry and set. With pigment powder, there's nothing being set here. It's all still freeform once dry. Think of it like glitter you spilled in the living room. It's not exactly stuck, but you wouldn't mop to get it out. And that's also 2 house cleaning metaphors now. But we can use that to our advantage. With a damp brush, we can actually go in and clean off the edges of the pigments, revealing the steel underlayer again, almost like a dry brush, but taking pigments away instead of adding them. Though there still is a cleanup phase, and while the dry brush from the first method would work too, we can also go in with a layering instead. Just getting the lighter silver on a nice but cheaper brush again, we can highlight the edges using the side of the brush and add dings and scratches among the rust to bring out the metal again. This one isn't about rust, but about color. What if they decided to paint their armor? Did they prime? Did they seal it? Probably not. So we can use this as a way to introduce color into our color scheme while still having the underlying look of metal parts. But we need to prepare it. So on the base of metallics from the start, I'm going to apply a generous layer of satin finish or medium to it. Just because they don't seal doesn't mean we should. This is where another non-starter kit element comes in, because we need to apply a layer between our seal and the paint we're going to put over top of it so that they stay distinct layers that can be chipped away. For this I have some Vallejo chipping medium. I've heard hairspray can also work for this, but if you've seen my intro, you know I have no need of that stuff in my place, so official stuff it is for me. The idea is that it creates a water-soluble layer between this base layer and the paint we'll put over top. So this only needs to go in the areas that are gonna get torn up. If there's anywhere you want paint to stay, don't put this there. So I'm using it along the edges where I think most of the chipping will happen, just straight from the bottle too, no thinning. Next is to get our coat of paint on the armor. I did a bit of testing with this. The one thing for sure is you don't want to water your paint down at all. So no wet palette, no wet brush, though a damp brush is probably fine. A fluid satin acrylic will be easiest to get on, so all those game color lines would come in handy here. But if using a heavy body, a tiny bit of medium to thin the paint works too. You want to pick something with a good opacity for one coat coverage, and it's going on pretty thick if we want depth in the scratches. I picked an earthy green for my musician here. This can go on much easier with an airbrush, but I wanted to show that it's not needed to use these kinds of products. Then we just have to do the unthinkable and scratch off the paint. There's many tools we can use. Old brushes, toothpicks, but for quick and efficient, can't beat this. First we have to wet the area we want to pull the paint up in. The chipping medium being water soluble means we need a bit of water and let it sit for a good 10 seconds. Then just turn the brush on and start touching it to the model. For a normal brush, you just have to do the rough scrubbing yourself. But the idea is we want to lift the paint off. Though since the pigments do come with it, it's good to rinse the brush off a bit as we go just so it keeps clean. From here we can touch it up using previous methods, adding highlights to the exposed metal, but also adding rust with the paints or powders. Now that we have some tricks to do these kinds of weathering effects, it's up to you on how you want to apply them, individually or even do a nice mix and match. Just be fearless. Don't worry about messing up, because no matter how bad you do, a touch up here, a highlight there, and you'll have beautiful chaos. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.